the best known biblical scholars in the world, and this is Dr. Bart Ehrman. And Dr. Bart Ehrman, who used to be a Christian but is an atheist, is agnostic, so he is fair and balanced in his judgment. He doesn't have a axe to grind towards Islam or towards Christianity, and he is no doubt a well-respected biblical scholar. So let's see what he has to say. How many of the earliest scriptures do we have?
We do not have the originals of the New Testament, period.
Exactly. In fact, if we look at the early manuscripts, when did we get most of the biblical manuscripts of the New Testament? Let's hear Dr. Bart Ehrman.
How many manuscripts of the New Testament do we have from the first Christian century? None. From the decades after the books were written, how many do we have? The years afterwards, the decade, none. Zero. How many do we have from the early second century? Say, manuscripts that clearly date up to around the year 150. We have one scrap. This is it. This may look big because it's a big screen. This is the actual size. It's the size of a credit card. It's written on both front and back. It's from John chapter 18. It has several verses on it. You can see this little scrap has parts of 7 lines on it. It's a very important manuscript because it's the earliest one we have. It's the early second century, and it is the only manuscript we have from the early second century. That's it. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the second and third centuries? We're not just talking about decades now after these things were originally written and copied and mistakes made and mistakes replicated and then more mistakes made and more replicated. We're not talking about years or decades. We're talking about centuries. How many complete manuscripts do we have from the second and third centuries? None. Zero. Well, if we have 5,500 manuscripts, where are they from? When are they from? Well, 94% of our surviving manuscripts come from the 9th century and later. 94% come from the 9th century, which is great if you want to know what the Bible looked like when Christians were reading it in the year 890. But if you want to know how they were reading it in the year 70, you've got a problem, because you don't have manuscripts from that period.
Now you see, knowing this, Christian apologists, these Islamophobes, they get upset, they burn with jealousy. So then they make wild accusations. There's so many Qur'ans. And we tell them, no, there's only one Qur'an. They say, oh, what about Warsh and Hafs? Well, those aren't two different Qur'ans. They're two different styles of recitation. Warsh begins with Al-Fatiha, so does Hafs. They recite all the way to Nas, right? But if one says Malik Yawmiddin or Malik Yawmiddin or Alayhim or Alayhum, that's not a different Qur'an. That's just a different method of recitation. So when we tell them it goes back to one Mus'haf, one Qur'an, we mean that standardization made by Uthman ibn Affan and all the copies that were made of it in the Rasam Uthmani, in the style of writing of Uthman radiallahu anhu, as he standard. We don't mean it's his personal copy that his blood was spilt on when he was attacked. No, that's either in a museum or not with us. Or is it the one that he wrote with his own hands? No. He ordered this compilation. Zayd ibn Thabit and the Sahaba and the companions came to a consensus on one Quran, and then copies were made. And they were sent out. And we'll talk about this, inshallah, as the researcher has mentioned in the introduction of the book. And these copies were sent to the different parts of the Muslim world. And then copies of those copies were made to be standards, and these are all considered the Musahif of Uthman. The standardization of Uthman, because they were all there to show one standard throughout the Muslim world. Until today, we recite according to that standard. We may print Qur'ans today with different colors to show qira'at, or add the fatha, dhamma, kasra, zair, zabar, pesh, sukoon, jazm, these dialects for non-Arabs and even Arabs to recite it properly, but they all have to go back to that one standardization. I don't mean one book, I mean one standardization, and copies of that were made upon the order of Uthman radiallahu, not by his own hand, and copies of those copies were made and sent out and kept in the Muslim lands. And we have many manuscripts today that are attributed to be from those copies. This is one of them. And that's why it says Mus'haf al-Sharif, the Mus'haf, the honored Mus'haf, as attributed to who? Uthman ibn Affan, radiyallahu anhu. Now, before I get into that, I want to explain something, that when we talk about the criticism of the Bible, somebody might say, oh, you're using Dr. Bart Ehrman, but what about the Quran? I'm going to quote the same Dr. Bart Ehrman and his idea of what the Quran, whether it's been preserved or not. Here you go. Fair and balanced.
Is that throughout your work, like for 40 years, we noticed that your main problem about trusting the Bible and the authenticity of the Bible is the technique of transmission, which is we don't have the originals, we don't know who wrote the Bible or who are the scribes who copied the manuscripts. There is a parallel transmission technique in transmitting the holy verses or the holy scriptures, which is followed by the Muslims, by transmitting the Quran and the traditions of their prophet. Have you ever considered looking at their techniques in transmission, because they do claim that it is unerratable?
Right. So the first thing I'll say is that's one of the reasons that I've had trouble with traditional Christianity, is because of the changes that scribes have made in the text. But it's not the only thing. Another issue is the internal discrepancies that you find within the New Testament and within the Bible, and I do know that the Quran has been faithfully transmitted over the centuries, and for some reason Christians decided not to transmit their book as faithfully.
The Quran doesn't have any of these problems, and therefore Islam is a superior religion. I'll tell you where I would agree. When it comes to the New Testament Gospels and the entire New Testament, we have many thousands of copies, and they do have lots and lots of differences among them. Hundreds of thousands of differences among our copies of the New Testament. But most of those differences are completely insignificant. Like, they don't matter for anything. We're counting like misspelled words and things like that. So they don't. But some of them do matter. They affect how you might understand a passage or a book or the entire New Testament. And the Quran's just not like that, obviously. I mean, the Quran has been faithfully copied for many, many centuries. So that part is absolutely right.